Hi everyone, today I'll be working with the Olympus EM10 II, and I'm going to be showing you how to use the Mysets, which is basically a way for you to save up to 4 groups of personalized settings that you can later easily recall for different types of shooting. So this tutorial will work with the EM10 II, the EM5 Mark II, and a lot of the pen cameras like the Pen PL8, the Pen PL7. However, this does not work for, say, the Olympus EM10 Mark III or the EM1 Mark II. Mysets are basically storage spaces in your computer that allow you to save customized settings for different types of photography. Meaning, maybe you want to have your camera set up one way for doing street photography, maybe you want it set up a different way for doing sports and action, and then maybe another way for like portraits or landscapes, etc. And you can save up to 4 different groups of customized settings in your camera and recall them quite easily. Now I've already done a full factory reset on the camera, so let's go into the menu and see where we can save any customized settings to begin with. So we'll just go into the menu, and it's in shooting menu 1, and it's the second line item here, reset a Myset. So we'll click OK. And actually the first thing I like to do is change this reset to basic. And the reason I do that is because anytime you reset the camera, if you do a full reset, it's going to erase all of the Mysets that we might set up later. So I like to just do a basic reset, which resets the exposure settings and some picture modes. So it's fine. Now we have 4 slots here, Myset 1, Myset 2, Myset 3, and Myset 4. So we can save 4 different groups of customized settings in each one. So the first thing I like to do, let me tap out, is just set up the camera for general shooting. So let's do that. So we'll go into the Super Control panel. And actually, first thing I like to do is make sure I'm in aperture priority, because that's normally how I like to shoot. And then we'll go into the Super Control panel, and I'm going to change the focus point to just a single focus point. And we'll leave the shutter mode there. Let's make this large super fine plus raw, or I'm sorry, this large fine plus raw. And single point, I think we're all good here. And then I like to go into the menu, and these are just basic settings. Go into the exposure menu. And I like to turn the noise filter off. And I like to set the auto ISO to run the full range up to 25,600. Like so. And let's see, also I normally like to shoot wide open, so let's go ahead and open the aperture all the way up. And in this case, it's going to be f3.5. All right, and that's all I need to do for now. Now, let's save everything I just did into one of the Mysets. So all you have to do is go into the menu, go back up to shooting menu 1, go into the Mysets, and then over here you'll see a little arrow, so we'll click over to the right, and we'll say set. We also have the option to reset, which erases everything. But in this case we want to save it, so we actually set it. So we'll just click OK. Now everything has been saved into Myset 1. Now let's set the camera up for, say, monochrome shooting. So let's go into the Super Control panel. And for street photography, I like to do monochrome, or monotone as they call it here. And we'll do +2 on the sharpness, +2 contrast. And we'll change this to centered metering, and I'm going to change the shutter mode to silent mode, and I think that's all I need to do there. So let's save that into Myset number 2. So we'll go into the menu, click down, click over to the right, and click OK. Now let's set up one for sports and action. So for sports and action, I like to shoot in shutter priority. So I'm going to move the camera into shutter priority and go into the menu, go into the Super Control panel, and we'll change this to continuous low, Change this to continuous autofocus. And I'm going to turn image stabilization off. And I do that because I like to set my shutter speed to 1/2000th of a second. And at that shutter speed, you don't really need image stabilization anyway. And then let's put this back to a natural color profile, just like so, and we'll turn off face detect. All right, good. So those are general settings for sports action, birds in flight, things like that. Let's save that into MySet 3. So we'll go into the menu, go all the way down here, click over to the right, and set, just like so. And then for the last thing, we'll just do something for portraits. So let's go back into aperture priority, click OK, and go into the super control panel. We'll turn face detect back on. We'll use the portrait mode, color mode, or picture profile. We'll change this back to single point autofocus. And we'll go back to a mechanical shutter. And I think that's good. And then, actually, let's lock the ISO into 200. Because for portraits, generally you're in a studio, for example, and the lighting's good and you can kind of control everything. So ISO 200, just for demonstration purposes. All right, now let's save that into MySet 4. So we'll go down here, click over to the right, and click Set. Now we've saved all 4 different groups of settings into the camera. So how do we recall them? Well, there's basically 3 ways to do it. And really, I'm going to recommend the third one as the highest, but I'll walk you through the first 2. The first way is just to recall it directly from the menu in the camera. But there's some catches with that, so we'll need to get into the fine print a little bit on that as well. But let's go ahead and recall, say, MySet number 1. So all we have to do is go into the MySet menu, click OK, but instead of clicking over to the right, we click the OK button. And now the camera's asking us, do we want to recall MySet number 1? So we can say, yes, we do. And if we look at the super control panel, you can see that everything has been set to our original settings with single point autofocus, single point focus point, mechanical shutter, etc. Let's recall MySet number 2. So remember, don't click right, just click OK. Say yes, I want to recall this, and click OK here. And then if we go back into the super control panel, you'll see that we're in silent shutter, monotone, single point autofocus, etc. Now pay attention here. I'm going to recall MySet number 3. So remember, we click OK, we say yes, let's recall, and tap out. And let's look at the super control panel. So we have our natural profile, continuous autofocus, continuous low shutter speed, but notice that the camera mode did not change, the priority mode. We're still in aperture priority. MySet 3 was supposed to be shutter priority 1/2000th of a second. So what's happening here is when you recall a MySet from the menu, the mode dial is going to override the menu. So if you have the mode dial in aperture priority, it's not going to shift to shutter priority, just simply recalling it from the menu. So just be aware of that. All right, now, of course, if we recall MySet number 4, click OK, say yes. Since we're in aperture priority, we're fine. And you'll notice we got into portrait mode, ISO 200 with mechanical shutter. If I put the camera into shutter priority, the camera will go into shutter priority, but you'll notice that we're still in portrait mode, etc. So let's recall Myset 3, like so. And check the settings. Now we're in the proper sports action modes that I originally intended. Now the other way to recall the Mysets is to actually program the Mysets into a function button. So when you push a function button, it recalls that specific Myset. And I recommend doing this if you only have like 2 Mysets, maybe 3, but generally 2 Mysets is about all I'd want to do if I'm going to recall them from the function buttons, and I would assign them to function 1 and function 3 over here. Because I really don't want to reassign these 2 buttons, the multifunction button, which has my highlights and shadows and some other things, and then the record button. I like to keep these exactly as they are by default. So let's reprogram function 1 and function 3 to be Myset 1 and Myset 3. It doesn't have to be Myset 3, it could be Myset 2 or 4, but that's the way I'm going to do it, just because it's easy to remember, right? Function 1, Myset 1, function 3, Myset 3. So what I'll do is, first I'm going to go into the menu and recall Myset 1 first. And then I'm going to go into the button menu right here and assign this to Myset 1. And then function 3, which is button over here, I'm going to assign to Myset 3. Like so. And then we'll click the menu button. Now we need to save this again. So we're going to go into the Myset and click over to the right and set or save. Now Myset 1 includes these 2 function buttons being set. Now let's recall Myset number 3. But first we have to go into shutter priority because that was our sports action. We'll go into the menu, recall Myset 3 by clicking OK and say yes, I want to recall. And then I'll double check shutter priority, everything looks good. Now let's program the same buttons exactly the same way, just to make things consistent. Function 1 will be Myset 1. Function 3 will be Myset 3. And I'll double check, that looks good, click OK, hit the menu button, and then let's save this into Myset 3. So we click over to the right and set. So we're in aperture priority, and I'm going to click function 1 to recall Myset 1, and you'll notice here it says Myset 1 aperture priority. If we check the settings, natural, single point autofocus, etc. Now function 3 was our sports action, but when we recall the Mysets via function button, we don't have to change the mode dial to shutter priority in this case. So watch, when I push function 3, you'll notice that it says Myset 3 and it says shutter priority. And we have our shutter speed. If I look into the our super control panel, you can see it also changed the continuous autofocus and shutter mode to continuous low. So that's kind of the difference from recalling from the menu versus recalling via the function buttons. I'm not sure why there isn't a consistency there, but just be aware of that. That's kind of the fine print. All right. Now, if you have to program more Mysets into function buttons, I think it's too confusing for me to do more than that. So that's all I like to do is these 2. Now, the third way to recall the Mysets, and I think the best way, is programming the Mysets into spots on the mode dial. So I would program them actually into iAuto, Art, Scene, and Story mode here on the mode dial, rather than into the function buttons. That way it'll free up the function buttons to do other things, like maybe I want a digital teleconverter, maybe I want HDR, but that's the way I prefer to do it. So it's also the easiest way. So let me show you. So let's just go into the menu. And we'll go down to the same menu, the button dial menu. And we'll change this to mode dial function. And right away it gives you MySet 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you'll notice all of them are off. So let's see what happens. We click over to the right. And I'm going to program MySet 1 to Eye Auto, MySet 2 to the art filter, and just bear with me, MySet 3 to the scene mode, and MySet 4 to, I think that they call that story mode. Now what happens is these 4 spots on the mode dial that I rarely use directly, like Eye Auto, I rarely use, if ever. When I put the camera into Eye Auto, you'll see that now this becomes MySet 1. We look in the Super Control panel, everything is the way we set it. If I move this to Art, this is now MySet 2. And you'll see that here, that it's MySet 2. And then I'll just turn the dial one more time. You'll see that we're now in MySet 3. But we also changed the mode of the camera, the priority mode, to shutter priority from aperture priority. So you don't have to think about are you recalling from the menu or from the function button. When you use the mode dial, it'll automatically recall all of those settings exactly like you saved them. And then of course, MySet 4 is our portrait mode, and we'll double check. And yeah, we're in portrait mode. Now let's go back to MySet 1, which was Eye Auto. So I can quickly change between MySet 1, 2, 3, and 4 just by turning the mode dial. But let's go into MySet 1, because in MySet 1, if you remember, we set up function 1 button and the function 3 button to recall MySets. So now there's a conflict, right? But let's see what happens. I'm going to push the function 1 button, which doesn't do anything. Function 3 button is not doing anything either. So because we're using the mode dial and the function buttons at the same time, Olympus disables the function buttons if they're assigned to a MySet, so you don't, run into that conflict, right? Because you don't want the mode dial to be in MySet 1, then recall via function 3, MySet 3 by accident. So that's kind of a safety, I guess, by disabling it. So what I like to do is reprogram the function buttons to more practical things. So I'm going to go back into the button menu, and I'm going to change function 1 button back to auto exposure lock, and I'm going to change function 3 button to, let's just say, digital teleconverter, or let's do HDR. There. So now I'm in MySet 1. If I push function 1 button, you'll see that it goes to AEL. And if I push the function 3 button, you'll notice HDR comes up. And it now toggles between HDR mode. Whoops. Stop it. My mistake. It toggles the HDR mode on and off. I had accidentally touched the Wi-Fi on the screen. Same thing with function 1. It still operates the AEL. And even if I go into MySet 2, you'll notice that the function buttons are still HDR and AEL. So when you access the MySets via the mode dial, you can program the function buttons to do other things, even though we saved them originally as MySet slots. Because look what happens when I go back into aperture priority. And then if I push the function buttons, they do what we expect, right? HDR and AEL. But let's recall MySet 1. from the menu. And the way you recall it again is you just click OK and say yes, recall. Now look what happens when I push the function 1 button. It still remembers that I programmed the buttons to recall Mysets. See, there's Myset 3, shutter priority. Myset 1, aperture priority. So just be really careful and really pick which way you want to do the Mysets. Don't do function buttons and mode dial to save Mysets, because it can get very confusing. Because like right now, if I go back into the mode dial and change this to iAuto, right? It doesn't remember that we changed the function buttons to like HDR and AEL. Because look what happens when I push function 1. Nothing. They're disabled again. And the reason for that is because when we went back to aperture priority mode and recalled the Myset from memory, it reset the function buttons to what Myset 1 originally had. So the best thing to do is don't use the function buttons for Mysets unless you're only going to use 2 Mysets. Then it's fine. You know, it really depends on your workflow. Like I know some people, they like to program the function button to just switch between monotone and color back and forth very quickly. But for me, I stick to the mode dial because it just works for me. But anyhow, that pretty much sums it up. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. And I appreciate you guys watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.